Number 1.
Christina was last seen in Hueytown, Alabama on September 17, 1973. At the time of her disappearance, she lived alone with her mother, Janet Gail Carter. A photo of Janet is posted with this case summary. She was originally from Winston-Salem, North Carolina. She was employed with an insurance company in Birmingham, Alabama in September 1973. Janet disappeared at the same time as her daughter. She and Christina's father had gotten divorced 2 months before, and Christina's father was seeking custody of the child. Janet was dating a married man at the time of her disappearance and said she was going on a trip to the Great Smoky Mountains with him. When Christina went missing, her family assumed they'd gone off on the trip to the mountains or that Janet had taken Christina into hiding because of the custody dispute. On October 7, Janet's newt-bound body was found inside a duffel bag alongside Clingman's Dome Road in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. She had been killed by suffocation the same day she was found. Her remains were not identified for a month, and it was only after this that authorities realized Christina was missing. An extensive search of the park turned up no indication of Christina's whereabouts. According to Janet's family members, her married boyfriend was in the area where Janet's body was found around the time of her death, but his wife provided an alibi for him. The man is now deceased. Because of the circumstances, authorities suggested Janet gave Christina to someone else to care for prior to her murder, and Christina might still be alive. This theory has never been confirmed, however. Janet's murder has never been solved, and there has been no sign of Christina since 1973.
Number 2.
Anne Marie was last seen in her home in the 3000 block of North 14th Street in Tacoma, Washington on August 31, 1961. She shared her bedroom with her 3-year-old sister, who had a broken arm at the time. In the middle of the night, Anne Marie brought her sister to their parents' room because the younger girl's cast was bothering her and she was crying. Their parents told them to go back to bed. Anne Marie has never been heard from again. Anne Marie's mother got up at 5:30 a.m. and discovered her daughter was missing. The front door had been locked and chained the evening before, but Anne Marie's mother found it unlocked from the inside and open. There was a small living room window they had kept open a few inches, and in the morning it was found open wider, with a piece of red thread stuck in the jamb. A garden bench had been taken from behind the house and put in front of the window. A faint footprint was found outside the open window. It had been distorted by the previous night's heavy rainstorm, but authorities believe it was from a kid's sneaker, size 6 or 7. A small man or a teenager would have feet that size. A similar footprint was found in the back of the house by the basement window. There was no sign of Anne Marie anywhere and no sign of a struggle in her bedroom. Her sister and her 2 brothers who slept in the basement had not been disturbed, but the family's dog had barked that night. Anne Marie's parents had heard it and assumed it was scared of the storm. Neighbors reported that in the days prior to Anne Marie's disappearance, they had seen someone in their yard peering into their windows, but they couldn't describe the person. Anne Marie's disappearance was treated as an abduction from the beginning. Authorities theorized that she was possibly taken by someone she knew. They investigated convicted sex offenders living in the neighborhood but could link no one to her disappearance. One man made a ransom threat, but he turned out to be an opportunist who had nothing to do with Anne Marie's disappearance and was charged with disorderly conduct. A teenage boy who was a neighbor of the Anne Marie family failed a polygraph about the case. He passed a second test, but the police never ruled him out as a suspect. An extensive search of Tacoma turned up no clues as to Anne Marie's whereabouts. Various suspects surfaced over the years, and several people claimed to be her abductor, but none of the stories could be verified. The case grew cold and remained so until the serial killer Theodore Robert Ted Bundy came into the spotlight in the 1970s. A photograph of Bundy is posted with this case summary. He was convicted of several murders and is suspected in scores more, including in the disappearances of Nancy Baird, Lynette Culver, Julie Cunningham, Susan Curtis, Georgianne Hawkins, Vicki Holler, Rita Jolly, Donna Manson, Denise Oliverson and many other girls and young women. He was executed in Florida in 1989. Bundy lived only a few blocks from Anne Marie's home at the time of her disappearance, and he apparently knew her, though accounts differ as to how well they were acquainted. He was only 14 years old when she disappeared and was not considered a suspect in his case until his killings came to light over 15 years later. It is worth noting that Bundy confessed to many murders he had not been charged with. He always denied involvement in Anne Marie's presumed abduction. Nonetheless, many people believe she was his first victim. Anne Marie was about to begin the third grade at Grant Elementary School when she vanished, and she had studied piano for 2 years. She was raised to be independent and, beginning in kindergarten, walked several blocks to school alone every day. Her parents stated she was intelligent, artistically talented and an obedient daughter who didn't cause any problems at home. Anne Marie's parents adopted another daughter a few years after her disappearance. Her father died in 2003 and her mother in 2008, but all 4 of her siblings are still alive. Her case remains unsolved.
Number 3.
Munson was last seen in Catonsville, Maryland on February 13, 1984. A neighbor saw him departing his residence at 7:50 a.m., presumably en route to Howard County, Maryland, where Munson was employed as an industrial arts teacher at Ellicott City Middle School. He never arrived at the school and has never been heard from again. His family reported him missing on February 14. On February 16, Munson's 1980 Ford Pinto was found parked on Brayside Road in Catonsville, 2 blocks from his home. The right front tire was flat. Munson's touring cap, school notebook and lunch bag were inside the vehicle. There was no sign of him at the scene. On February 27, 2 weeks after Munson's disappearance, 2 video store receipts bearing his name, traces of human blood, and a spent small-caliber shell casing were located in a blue 1973 Datsun 240Z vehicle parked at the edge of Leakin Park in West Baltimore, Maryland. The vehicle had been reported stolen the same day Munson vanished. The blood in the car was typed as O positive, but no one knows Munson's blood type and DNA technology wasn't available in 1984, and now the sample is too deteriorated to be tested, so it hasn't been confirmed that it was his blood. Authorities believe Munson may have been murdered in retaliation for giving evidence against an automobile theft ring. He had unknowingly purchased a stolen vehicle from one of the thieves, Dennis L. Watson, the year before he disappeared. This was the same car that was found at Leakin Park. Munson was scheduled to testify against Watson on February 16, 3 days after he vanished. Watson pleaded guilty to auto theft and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He was paroled in 1989. In 1973, a man who was scheduled to testify against Watson in an armed robbery case was killed. Watson was charged with first-degree murder, but he was never brought to trial because one of the witnesses in the murder case died. Watson's current whereabouts are unknown. He was interviewed about Munson's disappearance but maintained his innocence. Munson graduated from the University of Maryland at East Shore. He was well-liked at Ellicott City Middle School and took his students bowling twice a week. He is one of 6 children and has a reclusive nature. He enjoyed working on old cars which he kept in his yard, and he frequently left town on the weekends to visit his mother and siblings on the Eastern Shore. He was declared legally dead in 1985. The judge ruled he was the victim of a presumptive homicide. No one has been charged in his disappearance. It remains unsolved.
Number 4.
Jones was last seen with his friend, Toby Bing, at approximately 6:30 p.m. in the 100 block of Wild Horse Road on Hilton Head Island, South Carolina, on February 18, 1999. Jones was visiting from Atlanta, Georgia at the time. Bing received a call on his cellular phone while away from his residence during the day. The caller requested that Bing drive to Bluffton, South Carolina. They were driving Bing's white 1994 Toyota pickup truck at the time of their disappearances. Neither Bing nor Jones has been heard from again. Bing's vehicle was discovered abandoned in Savannah, Georgia on February 24, 1999, 6 days after he and Jones vanished. There was no sign of either man at the scene. Authorities discovered a large amount of blood at the Bluffton residence of Sean Rico Sullivan sometime afterwards. DNA tests confirmed that the blood was Bing's, and Sullivan was charged with his murder in April 1999. Investigators believe that Sullivan shot Bing at his residence on the day of his February 1999 disappearance. Sullivan was not charged in connection with Jones' case, although authorities believe he was also a victim of foul play. Investigators stated that the amount of Bing's blood located at Sullivan's house proved he could not have survived his wounds. Slugs and bullet holes were also discovered on the property. Sullivan was free on bail in South Carolina when he was arrested on drug charges in July 1999. Authorities discovered a 9mm Glock pistol in his possession at the time he was taken into custody. Kenneth Campbell was arrested as a material witness to Bing's presumed murder in August 1999. He was arrested after a 7-hour standoff with authorities outside of his home in Bluffton. Campbell was later charged with Bing's murder. Sullivan and 2 other drug dealers were convicted of conspiracy in 2002. Campbell and Sullivan were convicted of additional charges, including Bing's murder, in 2003 and were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Bing and Jones' remains have never been located.
Number 5.
Huggle resided in Fargo, North Dakota at the time of his disappearance and was employed as a traveling salesman. He was last seen at a bowling tournament in Fargo on February 26, 1989. After the tournament was over, he apparently traveled across the country for unknown reasons. Huggle called his ex-girlfriend on March 8, 1989. He told her he was in Kingman, Arizona. He said he'd been to 9 states in 9 days and had only $200 left and planned to return home to Bismarck. His ex-girlfriend stated he seemed depressed during the conversation and hinted he was feeling suicidal. He never arrived in Bismarck and has never been heard from again. Huggle's blue Ford Tempo was located in a desolate area off the road near the Death Valley National Monument in California on March 10. His belongings were inside the vehicle. Police followed a set of footprints for 6 miles away from his abandoned vehicle but eventually lost the trail. Huggle has never been located and it's unclear whether it was he who abandoned the car and walked into the desert. Park rangers could never prove he'd been at the park. The Death Valley area is known for its mysterious disappearances. Several tourists who have gone to see the monument have gotten lost and has never been seen again. Huggle's own father disappeared without explanation around the time he was born, but resurfaced alive and well several years later. Some investigators feel Huggle staged his disappearance to walk away from his life, just as his father did. There was one possible sighting of Huggle in California after he went missing, but this was never confirmed. Since his disappearance, he hasn't used his social security number, accessed his financial accounts, or been arrested anywhere in the United States. Bismarck, North Dakota police are investigating Huggle's case.
Number 6.
Jacob and his sister, Sarah, were initially abducted by their non-custodial mother, Catherine Ashley Huggle. A photo of Catherine is posted with this case summary. Catherine had suffered from symptoms of mental illness since childhood and was eventually diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. In August 2013, she was involuntarily committed to a psychiatric hospital and placed on medication. After her release from the hospital, Catherine moved first to a group home and then back in with Troy Turner, her children's father. She was enrolled in a day treatment program and wasn't supposed to be alone with her children, Sarah, Jacob, and her 6-year-old son. She had always been an attentive mother, however, and seemed to be making progress in handling her illness. On September 7, 2014, while Turner was at work, Catherine and the children were at her parents' house. At 4 p.m. Catherine borrowed her father's gray 2007 Nissan Rogue and told her parents she was going to take Jacob to get some pizza. About 2 hours later, she returned, without her son or the pizza, and said she'd left him at a friend's home. Jacob had not, in fact, been left at the friend's house, but her family believed the story. Catherine's parents took her and her son back to Troy's house. Troy arrived home from work at midnight and noted Jacob wasn't in bed but didn't realize he wasn't home. He thought Jacob had probably gone to sleep with one of his siblings, as he often did. The last time Sarah was seen was at 9:30 p.m. The next morning, when Troy woke up, he realized only he and his oldest son were home. Catherine, Sarah, and Jacob were gone. Troy started to call 911 but stopped when Catherine drove up. She told him she'd taken both Sarah and Jacob to a daycare center in Germantown, Maryland. He believed her and told the 911 operator it was a false alarm. Troy took Catherine to her day treatment program, picked her up at 2 p.m., and suggested they pick up the children from daycare. She told she couldn't remember the name of the daycare center but would direct him to it. She answered his questions evasively, however, and eventually Troy told her he was going to the police. She asked if they could stop at a Chick-fil-A restaurant to get a drink. When they went into the restaurant, Catherine ran out another door and disappeared. 4 days later, Catherine was located alone, walking down the street in Germantown, Maryland, wearing the same clothes she'd been wearing when she left. When police asked her where the children were, she at first said she'd left them with an old high school friend named Aaron, then led police to a playground in Germantown and said she'd abandoned both children there. She was arrested, charged with misdemeanor counts of parental abduction, neglect and hindering a police investigation, and committed to Clifton T. Perkins Hospital Center, a maximum security psychiatric hospital in Jessup, Maryland. Doctors there found her incompetent to stand trial. Catherine has been in the hospital ever since, but she has yet to be deemed competent. Turner and her family describe her as a highly intelligent woman and believe she may be feigning mental illness to escape the consequences of her actions. A person who is charged with misdemeanors and deemed mentally incompetent to stand trial can only be held for a maximum of 3 years. If they are charged with felonies, they can be held for an additional 5 years. In September 2017, 3 years after Sarah and Jacob disappeared, Catherine was charged with 2 counts of murder. She is still in the psychiatric hospital and still has to be deemed competent before she can stand trial. In 2019, the prosecution retained another psychiatrist to provide a second opinion on Catherine's competency, as for the past several years the doctors at Clifton T. Perkins Hospital had been saying she was incompetent, but her condition was improving and she might become competent someday. The second opinion doctor agreed with the hospital's doctors. She also believed Catherine was mentally unfit for trial. Although police believe Catherine murdered her children, there is no evidence to indicate their whereabouts. She has told the staff at the hospital that her children are safe, but she continues to refuse to reveal their location. Their cases remain unsolved, and foul play is suspected due to the circumstances involved.
Number 7.
Jami was married to Stephen Frank Scherer at the time of her 1990 disappearance, and the couple had a young son. They lived in Redmond, Washington at the time. A photo of Stephen is posted with this case summary. Their marriage was quite troubled, and Jami had decided to seek a divorce from Stephen by the autumn of 1990. She left their residence during the evening of September 29 and spent the night at her parents' home with their son. Jami agreed to meet Stephen the following morning after he pleaded with her during a phone call to reconsider her divorce plans. Jami left their child in her parents' care and drove to meet her husband during the morning hours of September 30, 1990. She called her mother at approximately 8:30 a.m. and said that Stephen grabbed her purse and ran off. Jami assumed he was headed for their residence and planned to meet him there to retrieve her belongings. She called her parents again at approximately 11:45 a.m. and said Stephen was indeed at the couple's home. Jami said she planned to stop at Taco Time, a local fast food restaurant, and purchase lunch before returning to her parents' house. She has never been heard from again. Her mother stated that Jami did not sound distressed during their final phone conversation. Stephen called Jami's parents approximately 30 minutes after his wife's final call. He called again 15 minutes later, inquiring as to Jami's whereabouts. Jami's mother told authorities that she was accustomed to her son-in-law's frequent phone calls. He often checked in many times a day when Jami was visiting her family and was very possessive of her. Jami's mother became concerned for her daughter's well-being when Stephen failed to call until 6 p.m., which was extremely unusual for him. He said there was no sign of Jami and he was going to pick up their son from her parents' house. Authorities learned later that Stephen had already contacted some of his own family members and friends to announce that Jami was missing by this time. Stephen told Jami's family that he was too distraught to return to the couple's home, so her parents allowed him to stay at their house with their grandson occasionally throughout the coming week. Jami's charcoal 1980 Mazda RX-7 was discovered abandoned several days after her disappearance in a Shoreline, Washington church parking lot. Her purse was missing from the vehicle, but investigators located her suitcase inside. Her clothing was packed in the luggage, but Jami's underwear was missing. There was no trace of her at the scene. Stephen was considered the prime suspect in Jami's disappearance from the onset. His friends reported that he began behaving strangely after she disappeared. 9 days after her disappearance, he attempted suicide with carbon monoxide but called 911 and was taken to a hospital before any serious damage was done. Stephen began dating other women within a few weeks of Jami's disappearance. He frequented bars and wore Jami's panties tied around his arm. He also wore her necklace, telling people it made him feel closer to his missing wife. Stephen frequently claimed to be a widower on official documents. He informed several friends that Jami was killed in a car accident and told others she had been a victim of the Green River serial killer. Her car showed no sign of being involved in any type of traffic incident, and there was no evidence to suggest Jami's disappearance was linked to the Green River cases. Stephen aroused more suspicion when he reportedly told another friend he was glad Jami was gone. Stephen took over Jami's finances in early October 1990 and cashed all of her assets. His sister contacted authorities and stated that she saw a large red spot on the carpeting of her brother's residence shortly after Jami vanished. Investigators searched the Scherers' home and discovered that a portion of the carpet had recently been repeatedly steam cleaned. A new piece of carpet had been sloppily placed over the area where Stephen's sister stated she saw a stain. Neighbors said that Stephen hired a carpet cleaning service during the days following his wife's disappearance. A friend said that he saw a shovel in Stephen's truck on October 1, the day after Jami was last seen. The shovel was not normally carried in the vehicle. Investigators did not have enough formal evidence to charge Stephen in connection with Jami's case for several years. Jami and Stephen met in 1986. Jami was initially unaware that Stephen had a prior criminal record for abusing a former girlfriend. He'd hurt her so badly she had to be hospitalized. Jami's loved ones noticed a dramatic change in her behavior after becoming involved with Stephen. He requested that she bleach her brown hair blonde and also asked her to get breast implants. Jami and Stephen were married in 1987. Their son was born in 1988. By most accounts, Stephen was very possessive of his wife. Besides Jami's mother's statements regarding his constant phone calls while Jami visited her family, he also apparently made further restrictions on Jami's time. Jami lost one job due to excessive tardiness and absences in the late 1980s, and her family and friends maintain that Stephen's demands caused the job loss. Investigators learned that Stephen placed advertisements in adult magazines looking for group sex while married to Jami. It is believed that Jami consented to such arrangements at her husband's request, as nothing in her past leads authorities to believe she was involved in such relationships before she met Stephen. Stephen also asked friends to participate in group sexual encounters. Stephen continued to add to his criminal record throughout his marriage to Jami. He was charged with assaulting a police officer, burglary, theft and various traffic violations in the late 1980s. Stephen was treated for alcoholism around this time as well. Jami had apparently tired of Stephen's behavior and wanted a divorce by September 1990. It has been established that she was having an affair with a friend of Stephen's at the time of her disappearance. Stephen's sister reported that he asked her to make an appointment for him to meet with a priest several years after Jami vanished. He claimed that he did something bad and needed to confess. He also continued to have problems with the law in the 1990s. Stephen was wounded by a gunshot in a 1992 bar brawl. He also violated the terms of his probation for a previous arrest by using cocaine and failing to meet with his probation officer. He was given deferred prosecution in Arizona in 1999 for possession of crack cocaine. Stephen has used at least 12 different aliases over the years, many of them equipped with false identification. He has a criminal record under his most commonly used identification, Stephen Christopher Michaels. Jami was declared legally dead in 1997. Stephen was arrested on first-degree murder charges for her presumed death in March 2000. He was found guilty and sentenced to 60 years in prison in June 2000. Stephen has maintained his innocence throughout the years. While he was in prison, additional years were added to his sentence after he was charged with attempting to have Jami's parents' house burned down. His son was living there at the time. It is unlikely that Stephen will ever be released. Jami has never been located. Foul play is presumed in her disappearance due to the circumstances involved.